don't really live in a democracy also didn't start with Citizens United. There's a long story about why that is, and of course it's kind of ebbed and flowed at different moments in our history. So to that end, the way that we want to build this amendment campaign is all about building a democracy movement, or a movement against corporate rule. And what does democracy mean, just so we're saying the same thing? Anyone?
Government for the people, by the people.
Yes, the people rule. At its core, at its root, it's Greek. Demos, kratia, means the people have the power, right? And so I'm not talking about, voting or, running for office, even per se. I'm talking about the people having the power. And the way that we describe it is right now, we live in a system of corporate rule, because the fundamental public policy decisions for our society are being made by corporate CEOs and corporate executives, not the people. So whether we go to war, what is in our food supply, the transportation options available to us, et cetera, we could go on down the list of these decisions are actually private decisions made by corporations. Not all corporations, actually a very select few corporations. And so we need to be real about the situation that we're in. So we don't really describe it as like reclaiming democracy, because we actually never really had a democracy to reclaim. And that's really critical for us, because Move to Amend our belief is that the way that we build power, the first step is to be honest and real about the situation that we're in. Not to gloss over it, not to kind of make it seem like, this could get done tomorrow, but actually to, as a people, come to terms with how we do not control the decisions and the lawmakers in our country. And then from there, though, once we kind of make that realization, we can move forward. Come on in, there's plenty of chairs over here. So, our amendment, which was introduced in Congress in February of this year by Representative Rick Nolan from Duluth, Minnesota, and Mark Pocan from Madison, Wisconsin. It's called the We the People Amendment. And these are the two main principles of it. Artificial entities do not have constitutional rights, and money is not speech, and therefore campaign spending and contributions can be regulated by government. And in fact, it says government shall regulate campaign spending. And it also says that all campaign spending will be disclosed as well. So that's our amendment. There are some other amendments that just more deal with only overturning Citizens United. But again, we want to take this opportunity that Citizens United afforded us of all of these people kind of waking up to the situation in a way that we had never seen before. I've been working on this issue for 13 years. And honestly, we expected this to be, maybe a media framing opportunity. Maybe we could kind of insert the idea of corporate personhood in and not just have it be about money and politics. And maybe, we'd get like 10,000 people to sign our petition. And the organizations that all had been working against corporate personhood, we had kind of come together to put out this call. And then we got 10,000 people like in the first couple days. And we realized, honestly, to tell you the real lowdown, we realized, crap, we actually need to launch this campaign. Like, for whatever reason, the time is right now in a way that it hadn't been before. And so we've kind of spent our first year catching up to the grassroots, which is actually many good things about that, but it's a little disconcerting, especially for a Virgo like me that likes everything to be in order. But we're there now. We have a whole infrastructure, and our priority is on having local groups. So that's why I hope that out of this will come a local group here in Santa Fe. So let's talk a little bit about how it is that Citizens United is not really the beginning or the end of the problem. So I'm going to flip this for a moment. And I think when we're talking about amending the Constitution, we should start with making sure that we understand how the Constitution works, right? So let's go there for a minute. So the Constitution You're with me that it is the supreme law of the land, the foundation of all law, right? And so, who are the entities in the Constitution? What's the first one? First three words.
We the people.
We the people. Yes, thank you. We the people. And there's another entity that is described in the Constitution. What is that? You know?
Congress.
That's an element of it.
The union?
But it's
The perfect union?
government, right? And much of the Constitution actually talks about the ways that government cannot infringe on the people, right? I know this is not something that, as Americans, we do since high school, so that's okay if you don't remember this. So, under this framework, the people are free and sovereign. And so all legitimate power resides over here. Right? So power to the people. It's not just a Black Panther slogan. It's also the premise of the Constitution. And to the extent that government has any power, power is delegated to government. So so for example, how many people live in Santa Fe now?
70,000.
70,000? Okay. So, who wants to go to a meeting of 70,000 people to decide where we're going to put the stop signs and, which streets are going to be one-way street? Nobody, right? So we delegate a certain amount of power to government at different levels in order to serve the people. So government in this framework is subordinate and accountable. And who is it accountable to? The people. Yes, exactly. And under this framework, people have individual rights. So let's pause for a minute. What are some of the rights that we have spelled out in the Constitution? Right to privacy. Great. Others?
Speech.
Right to free speech, First Amendment. Freedom of religion, also part of the First Amendment.
Assembly.
Freedom of assembly, another part of the First Amendment. There's lots of elements to the First Amendment. Any others?
Guns.
Second Amendment, yes.
Furthermore.
Anything else?
Search and seizure.
Search and seizure, that's the Fourth Amendment.
Fifth Amendment. Self-incrimination.
Self-incrimination. And the Fifth Amendment also says that our property cannot be taken without being compensated, right? Any others that folks remember?
Is that press?
Freedom of the press, yes, that's also part of the First Amendment.
Right to an attorney in a criminal case.
Right to an attorney, and a speedy trial, and all of that. And it's not part of the... So we named a bunch that were in the Bill of Rights. Those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Also want to flag some others, right?
Right to a jury trial.
Right to a jury trial. Right, that's also part of the Bill of Rights.
Women's right to vote.
Yes, so the right to vote shall not be abridged based on sex. That would be the 19th Amendment. Others?
Prohibition and elimination of
Prohibition, yeah. That's not so much a right, it's more like in that, duties of government, you can't deny us the right to drink. Except for if we're certain. So that we can vote if we're over 18. The right to vote will not be abridged based on past condition of servitude or color of our skin. It's worth noting that we don't actually have a constitutional right to vote just on its own, right? Can't infringe it based on sex, can't infringe it based on race, but if you're the state of Florida and you infringe it just based on incompetence and corruption, the Supreme Court can actually instill a precedent because we don't have a constitutional right to vote to fall back on. So there's some elements that perhaps are missing from our Constitution, right? Some affirmative rights that we could go beyond. And just to kind of flag that, is that's one of the things that Move to Amend is really interested in provoking, because we have all these rights about what government can't do, but we don't have affirmative rights, really. What about if we had a right to health care? Where would we be as we're on the precipice of going into 2014 and this new system, which regardless of what you think about it, I think the common understanding is universal health care might actually have been a better bet. And if we had a right to health care, that would have been the whole debate, is how to make sure everyone has health care for free. Or a right to clean air, or clean water.
Free education.
Free education, yeah. Or what if a river had a right to be healthy and flow from Colorado to Mexico? So all of these things, and there are many constitutions that have been written since ours that actually get at these human rights, which are kind of lacking in ours. But as Americans, we're kind of taught, don't go there. This is the best one that anyone could ever imagine or think of. But that really, really limits us. So, a little bit of a rant, Kaitlin rant against the Constitution. But nonetheless, let's keep going with this. So we talked about individual rights, and over here, my lines are a little bit messed up, but this goes with that. Collective duties is the idea for government. So never do people have duties to the government in the Constitution. And government also does not have rights in the Constitution. And then the last one, and we spoke about this, a couple people talked about elements of this. So the people are private and government is public, right? So this is a pretty decent idea and a decent framework for how we might do representative democracy. We should try it in this country, actually. Because before we, go on and on about how wonderful this is, let's talk about the founding. So, we the people. When this document was written and then ratified, who were people?
White males that own land.
White males that own land. And in some respects, you actually had to belong to a certain religion in some states. And sometimes you had to own a certain amount of land. Like if you wanted to vote for state rep, well, then you actually had to have a lot of property. And if you wanted to vote for city council, maybe just a house would work. Right. So what percentage of the population was that were the people?
About 10.
10? How about a little lower?
5.
5? Yes, between 5 and 10. So like 5, 6%. So to say that another way, 95% of the adults, we're not even talking about kids, the adults that lived here at the founding of this country were not considered people. So who was left out?
Women.
Women.
Slaves.
Slaves. I actually prefer to say blacks or African Americans,
Okay.
and not to check you, but I think we often we say slaves, and that kind of puts aside like this is human beings, right? So human beings with too dark of a skin color, not people. Who else?
Native American.
Not wealthy, right? If you were a white person and you didn't have land, then you also were not a person. Indentured servants, forget about it. Native people, nope, not even human beings, like, forget about legally speaking, like, not even human beings in the cultural sense either, right? And women are, like, chattel property. So, and I'm not saying this to kind of be like, one, let's pat ourselves on the back about how far we've come, or two, to just kind of make sure that I've got the little footnote in, like, this country is great, except for this. I actually think that we need to pause there because the reverberations of the violence of the founding of this country impact everything that's going on today still, right? And we as a people, if we're going to talk about building a democracy movement to make real the promise of American democracy, that's not something to just kind of put aside and then, hey, we'll get back to that later. It actually completely affects who's in this room today, right? Who participates in the political process, where people live. For folks who have do social media, I saw this map recently, this series of maps. Did you see it too? Where somebody went and put a little dot for every single person in some large cities, and then they color-coded them based on race. And it is stark, the segregation that we still have going on in this country in places that you wouldn't think, like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Detroit. Forget about it. It's just a straight up line through the middle of the town. On here, this side of the line, there's the white folks, and on this side of the line the black folks, and literally in Detroit, actually, the white folks have built it as a wall. So it used to be a street, and now it's a boarded up wall, like a la Berlin Wall in Detroit. And so if we're talking about building a movement where the people are in charge, we have to figure out how to cross over those boundaries. And, not everyone in this room is white, but most of the people are. Most of the people at any Move to Amend talk are. I will say that those folks who I serve on the national leadership team with are not. We're a very diverse group of ages, geography, race, ethnicity, and we've been very intentional about building alliances with folks in the coalition at the national level, because if you look at the history of this country, anytime we've had a successful populist movement, it is because it has been both intergenerational and also multiracial. So that's some work that we need to do and we need to think about as we're talking about how we're going to get this amendment passed. So, major issue with the Constitution, but also, as Howard Zinn said, you can look at the history of our country as a series of struggles of people to drive them, people who were left out, to drive themselves into this document. Yes?
I want to add something to what you just said. My study of history in the United States, the successful movements in this country have been when people have a personal stake in it, whether it's Vietnam because people were going to go and get killed over there, or the women's movement, or the black movement. So what is Move to Amend? I mean, on a general level, it's obvious. But when you get down to the individual person, what are you doing to make it clear to them that they have a personal, that we have a personal stake?
Well, that educational work and connection work is best done at the local level, because each community kind of operates differently. But for example, we are making connections with folks who are working against the school-to-prison pipeline and the prison industrial complex, about how private prisons, have a mandate that they give to government to lock people up and put people in jail, and the people who end up in jail are black and brown folks on the whole. And so, that is an impact of corporate rule and the consolidation of corporate power at the government and the policy level. We are, certainly anything having to do with protecting the environment. There's probably a corporate actor on the other end of promoting the policies of pollution and destroying the planet. So, there's all these issues, and there's a lot of information on our website, and you have to kind of vary it and take people where they are at and what they're concerned about. And one of the things we also need to grapple with is, it's not like we can ask people who are working on immediate, survival issues to stop doing that and work instead on this longer-term issue. But our job is to make the connections and the solidarity so that everyone sees that this is actually the same movement. So if you're working against foreclosure, you're actually working against corporate rule and for democracy. And so, not that you have to come do Move to Amend, but that we're part of the same struggle. And so we could go into lots of different examples, but I would encourage you to check out the website.
I'm suggesting that needs to be the top of the list of things that Move to Amend puts out in its publicity, because the labor movement, the women's, all of them are personal. They were personal, and Move to Amend does not sound very personal.
Right, and that is really the work of our local affiliates, because again, you all can speak best to people in Santa Fe or northern New Mexico about what it is that is affecting people in Santa Fe and northern New Mexico. I now live in California. I am not the best person to talk to people about what's affecting their lives. And so that is what we ask and support our local affiliates in doing. I saw him here and then back there.
Well, I think something that affects almost every person, either personally or their parents or grandparents, is that the plutocracy wants to get rid of or decimate Social Security and Medicare, and this is going to impact most of the population. So,
absolutely, that's a great one as well. Yeah.
One of the other issues seems like it's that right now we don't have the power, it's in the corporate hands. And even going through a constitutional amendment seems like, I mean, we can't get it on the ballot in November, right? First, I don't know the reasons why exactly, but I presume it's because of this corporate agenda, and they can kind of keep moving it to the back burner of different committees, and somehow it I don't know why exactly. That'd be a good thing for you to maybe speak on a little bit, but it seems like, the issue is that people feel powerless, and sure enough, we can't even get this constitutional amendment in the ballot. Right? Mm-hmm. It's waiting for what?
Well, some of it is mechanics. Not every state has the initiative process. In fact, actually, New Mexico, you can't do a citizens initiative. You'd have to go through your legislature. So it varies state by state what the tactics need to be. But I mean, at the end of the day, what we're up against is a tremendous amount of money that has fully taken over our government, and we're kind of on the outside. But I look to past movements that didn't have internet or telephones even, and they're able to, like the abolitionist movement. I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'll just say it now. The entire, it wasn't just, should we have slavery, yes or no, is it mean and bad? The entire economic system was built on that institution. And so people who were suggesting that it needed to be abolished were seen as crazy initially, right? And yet, they still moved forward and ultimately were able to win. And so I think our job is to make people feel empowered, to recognize their power. Because consent to the governed is not just like a nice idea. There is the reality that this all works because we kind of move along and let it work, right? And so how do we create situations, and I would suggest that standing on the street corner with a sign, can feel like, God, I just got to do something, and I will do that. And so not to denigrate anybody if you stand on the street corner with a sign, I have definitely done that. But I don't think that that's going to pull most people out to feeling like they are exercising their power. 80% of Americans think that Citizens United was a bad decision once they have it explained to them what it is, and that corporations should not have the rights of people. And corporations should not have the rights of people doesn't need to be explained to people. 80%. So Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green, doesn't matter. Young, old. But what's lacking is that 80% feeling like there's anything they can do about it. And so I don't have all the answers on how to do that. If I did, we'd already be done, right? But that is something that we collectively need to figure out. And movements before us have been able to do so. So, yeah, sure.
So I have a suggestion of how to do it.
Okay.
So if we had a campaign that started with a petition drive that said, and got, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people in each congressional district in the country to pledge that I will not vote in the 2014 election for anybody who does not write on the dotted line a pledge that in the 2015 congressional session that they will support, vote for, co-sponsor a bill that will get this amendment on the because it doesn't have to go to, well, eventually it does have to go to the states, but to get the Congress to pass it. And I think what needs to be added to this is that all federal elections will be publicly funded. That has to be in the amendment because otherwise the Congress will say, the court will say that that's unconstitutional. But we got to get money out of politics.
That's
and the only way we're going to...
If money is not speech, then the court wouldn't have any basis to say that, just to clarify.
No, that's only for corporations. No, we have to get money with the Koch brothers.
Money is not speech for individuals and corporations under the amendment language.
But that doesn't... that still allows me and you and the Koch brothers to give $20,000 or $50,000 to a candidate. And we have to get total money out of politics so that people in Congress can vote on the issues rather than who is giving them the money.
Right. So you have identified a very similar strategy to our Pledge to Amend campaign, which I was going to talk about a little bit later. We're focusing on states because if states don't ratify this, then it's a moot point, and states are going to be needed to actually pressure Congress to do it. Because news to y'all, Congress is not going to take the leadership on this. And we could have, again, 80% of the public, People wanted to end the Iraq War. People wanted to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Congress doesn't give a crap.
But wait a minute,
we need to, our position is that we need to focus on the states first and build up to Congress and basically put Congress in the position of being on the defensive and reacting to us. And there's other folks with their hands up, and there's going to be, plenty of time to weigh in, but you've already spoken 3 times. Yeah.
Ethan had said in the beginning that our state had already passed something that wanted to get rid of Citizens United, and we need to get 38 states. Is that the same thing as ratifying something on our state level, or is it different?
No. So probably folks couldn't hear that. Yeah. So he was asking about what it is that New Mexico passed. New Mexico passed a resolution, which we believe is definitely the first step. A resolution is a non-binding statement for or against something. Not to discount it, though, the Declaration of Independence, also a resolution, but it's non-binding. So it basically puts the ball in Congress's court and says, will you please do this, Congress? And it kind of lets the voice be known. So that's the first step, but it's not binding, it's not ratifying, and it's not. And I will talk, we do have a suggestion for how states could actually kind of up the ante next after passing a resolution, or maybe just in lieu of a resolution. So, yes?
I'm wondering how does Move to Amend dovetail with the other organizations who, like the Public Campaign, who are working for public funding, clean money, elections, yada yada. So do you see that as a multi-pronged attack? Do you see their attempt at clean money as vitiating the power of this movement? How do you see that?
We see them as complementary. The reason why our amendment, and we've gone back and forth, and pretty much everyone, I can't think of a person that I've heard from Move to Amend that doesn't support publicly funded elections. Our amendment doesn't say it because we feel as though that's more of a policy, political question in terms of how elections will be funded. Mm-hmm. And what we need first is to be clear to because the court has, moved in the direction of overturning public campaign laws. And so by saying that money is not speech and government has the authority to regulate campaign spending, then that is kind of the permission slip that's needed to allow for clean money. And the exact way to do clean money or whether to do it, we feel like is a policy question for different levels of government to maybe do differently. Mm-hmm. And so we don't think that it belongs in the foundational language. But there are certainly clean money activists who work with Move to Amend and vice versa, and it is a parallel track towards the same agenda, I believe.
Thank you.
So I do want to make the case for why it's more than Citizens United really quickly. So let's go back for a minute. We're talking about the Constitution. Corporations, properly understood, would be on this side of the line. And when this country was founded, at the time of this document, it wasn't like airplanes, right? They didn't exist yet. Corporations did exist. However, they're not in the Constitution anywhere. And the reason for that is that our framers of the Constitution had a memory of corporations. Corporations were actually the entity that colonized this country, and much of the expansion and discovery of the New World, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason for that is that in England, they had almost no money, right, at the time. And here in Santa Fe, we'll be acutely aware of the fact that Spain came to the New World first, right? And Spain and Portugal had plenty of money, and they were putting it into this colonial enterprise. But England, Britain, did not, because Britain had just fought a war with France. And so the king tried to get the aristocracy to join in and front the money to basically, get in on the goods. And the aristocracy was not interested in doing that because of this thing called inherited debt. What's inherited debt? Kind of self-explanatory, right? So if you don't pay off all your debts in your life, then your son is going to get your debt, and then if he doesn't, his son is going to, and ultimately someone's going to end up in debtor's prison. And why am I saying son?
Prima.
Right, because women are not even people, they're like basically property themselves, right? So it's all patriarchal, but this inherited debt doctrine puts a real chilling effect on colonial conquest by the aristocracy because they don't want to ruin their whole family, right? So the king says, good news, I am sovereign. I can create a new entity because I can do whatever the heck I want. And so I'm going to create a new institution that never existed before. I'm going to call it a crown corporation, and it's going to not have inherited debt. You're going to only be liable for the initial investment that you make. So the concept of limited liability is created, right? Which is part of the definition these days about what a corporation is. So fast forward over to the Revolutionary War. What's the biggest corporation in the world at the time of the Revolutionary War? The British East India Company, right? And that was a major target of the colonists turned revolutionaries because Parliament and the East India Company were totally in it together. Every single member of Parliament and King George were stockholders in the East India Company. And so they were passing laws to privilege that company over others. Sound familiar? And the revolutionaries, or the patriots, ultimately responded. Boston Tea Party was one act of resistance to that. They were trying to tax all other tea and force folks to buy the East India Company tea. So the colonists knew about corporations, and as such, for that reason, they put the chartering of corporations and all of that at the state level. And there are also a lot of limits on corporations. So does anybody know what some of those limitations were on those early corporations for like the first 50 to 75 years of this country's history?
They only existed for like 20 years or 2
Yeah, they
years.
existed for a limited amount of time.
The purpose had to be clearly defined.
The purpose had to be clearly defined. And was there something else you were going to say? Yes, limited scope. So if you were going to build a bridge, then that was all you could do is build the bridge. Anything else? Yes. Ultimate threshold for whether you got to become a corporation was, do you serve the public good? And the process of incorporating wasn't like just some paper that you send in and get rubber stamped by the Secretary of State. It was actually basically like passing a bill through the legislature to bring each corporation into being, and the threshold that they would look to of whether it should happen is this going to serve the public good? But imagine if that was what was going on today, right? And you had to make that case. Anything else?
Charter could be revoked.
Yes, your charter could be revoked. If you went beyond these limitations, then your charter could be revoked by the state legislature. Anything else? Corporations were banned from making charitable contributions or political contributions. So it was actually a felony in Wisconsin until 1953 to contribute, for a corporation to contribute to a political campaign. So that's relatively recently, right?
Yeah.
And then there were others. Each state had their own that were written into the charters, and then they were also in the corporate codes of the policy of the state. And then most states actually had a section on corporations in their constitution, and many still do. So I hear that in New Mexico it's actually against the law for any state legislator to accept a train ticket from a railroad company. Still in there from the populist day when folks were responding to the power of railroad companies. And there's some other good stuff in there too. So corporations are over here on this side of the line. It's like a driver's license, right? So if you drink and drive, maybe not so much in New Mexico, but if you drink and drive somewhere else, maybe it's different now, but I remember when I was in high school, not that I drank and drive, but it was a problem, that your license can be revoked. It's not a right to drive. It's a privilege, and if you follow the rules, then you can partake in the privilege, and if you don't, then government will take it back from you, right? So that's what being a corporation was. And they were used to build the infrastructure of this country. So roads, bridges, sometimes factories, but mostly it was these public works projects that the government didn't have enough money to pay for with their own money. Kind of the same thing as the King of England, right? I don't have the money to go rape, pillage, and plunder. Will you help me out? Well, in this case it was, I don't have the money to build bridges and roads and factories and all this infrastructure. Let's use private money, but we're going to limit it because with concentrated capital comes concentrated power, right? So corporations are over here. So I'm going to skip to the Civil War, right? Okay, so what happens at the end of the Civil War? We get three new amendments to the Constitution. So what are those? 13th Amendment, outlaw slavery. 14th Amendment, see you, you're almost there. Guarantees equal protection and due process of the laws. It says no state can deny equal protection and due process of the laws. And then the 15th Amendment is the one that says that your right to vote will not be abridged based on your skin color, in a nutshell. Right? So, we have a whole segment of people who now drive themselves into this document, right? And the 5% suddenly shoots up of people who are people. So who are the people that we're talking about?
Slaves.
African Americans. So, let's, yes. Yes, exactly. African American men, yes. And in 1879, women like Susan B. Anthony say, well, 14th Amendment, no state can deprive anyone of equal protection under the law. All these laws that keep us from voting at the state level, I'm going to go vote. So they go and vote, direct action, and they're arrested. And then they sue in response and say, these laws violate my 14th Amendment rights. It goes up to the Supreme Court, case Minor v. Hepperset. And the Supreme Court says, nope, 14th Amendment isn't for you, ladies. Go home. Only for black men. And so let's pause for a minute on the abolitionists, because we really believe that we need to look at past movements that have gotten this done before to understand. Not that it's exactly the same situation now, obviously, but we can learn some stuff from past movements. So the abolitionist movement had a multi-pronged strategy. They had a political strategy, right? They created a new party to champion the idea of abolition. What was that party? Republican Party, yes. So they had the political strategy. They also had a direct action strategy. So what was the first direct action? Probably won't remember this because this is not the way history books describe it, but this is what it was. The Underground Railroad, right? Harriet Tubman. So there are white people and black people who are part of the Underground Railroad, folks who are in the slave system and folks who have escaped out of it or who were never part of it, participating in liberating people from the system. And it was creating such a bleeding effect on the South that they were freaking out. It was costing them so much money that they lobbied Congress to pass a law to respond. So Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced the free states to aid these bounty hunters who were grabbing people. Oftentimes it wasn't even people who ever had been slaves, right? That didn't matter. You're the wrong color. I could say you're a slave, blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't just, you could do this. It's that the National Guard or the local police forces or the government or the court system of these free states that were very explicitly anti-slavery were forced to help aid that kidnapping. And so they didn't take that line down at all. There was there was a huge response. So in states like Wisconsin and Kansas, folks just flagrantly ignored the Fugitive Slave Act and organized themselves, not just like, we're going to individually ignore this, or talk about it badly, but we're going to actually orchestrate direct rebellion against it. So one example, in Racine, Wisconsin, relatively small town, there was this man named Asa Glover who was at a saloon he was black, but he actually didn't even really look that black, but he was, with a bunch of white folks, and they were playing cards, and somebody comes in and says, I claim this man, he was a slave, and I need to return him, etc. So he takes him, and they put him in jail to hold him until the next day. And then this man named Sherman Booth, who actually went on to run for office and was a real organizer in the Republican Party, got on his horse, and actually Paul Revere did not do the rides, that's a myth, but Sherman Booth did do a Paul Revere-style ride through the streets of Racine and the neighboring towns and said, the slave catchers are among us, the slave catchers are among us, we must convene. And so they gather at the courthouse, or the jail, where Asa Glover is, 10,000 people. The National Guard is called in, but they refuse to show up. And they're trying to figure out what to do, and they decide that, to talk about, removing your consent, they decide that they have more authority to do what they're going to do than the federal government or Congress. And so they use their sovereign power to pass what they called the writ of open sesame on the spot right there in a town meeting that they organized. And they used a battering ram to help enforce their new writ. And they knocked down the door. And again, National Guard, they're like on high alert, nobody comes. And they're able to free Asa Glover. And the writ of open sesame reads, like the Declaration of Independence, about how they have a moral obligation to deny the vile Fugitive Slave Act and this horrible Congress that would have the audacity to go against the humanity of a whole race of people. And so we have the moral high ground, and we will do whatever the damn well we want, right? And that's just one example. So that's another example of civil disobedience, right? But in a collective way, not as much an individualized way. So and then ultimately, the Republican Party is so successful, and they started in a room like smaller than this one, right? But they're ultimately gaining power at the state level through their political strategy, such that they actually, states like Wisconsin, start to say, if Congress doesn't repeal this Fugitive Slave Act, then we are going to secede from the Union, because we don't want to be part of a country that's going to put up these kinds of policies. And that was before the South seceded from the Union. So this idea of states' rights and it being a conservative notion used by racists, that's actually not its original beginning. And ultimately, they didn't need to secede, right? Because they took both houses of Congress and then the presidency with Abraham Lincoln, and the South saw the writing on the wall, so they left. And that whole strategy of having states say, this may be the law, but we're not going to follow it, I think is something that we could look to. And, why not have the Constitution of New Mexico, through an initiative of the people, say that corporations don't have rights here and money is not speech? If Congress refuses to move, then we don't need to wait for them. We could actually, at the state level, be putting forward the policies that we want. And this isn't something we invented or the abolitionists invented. This is happening right now today with other issues. What's one that comes to mind? Marijuana. Medical marijuana. Yes, I do live in Humboldt County, so it's a thing there. But yes, California kind of started it off with legalizing medical marijuana, but now we're seeing the domino effect of states not just talking about medical marijuana, but full-blown marijuana legalization. And what happens there? Our local government, our state government, they do not comply with the federal government. The federal government needs to send in their own resources to pull up people's plans and to enforce their law. The Obama administration has to threaten local elected officials personally. And that is the only reason, why it's still there. It's a threat. But they're losing their grasp on that issue, right? Because the culture has shifted. And so the law is changing along after it. And so we also really believe in the principle that law follows culture, not the other way around. So our job is to shift the culture. The good news is the culture is already with us, right? So organize the people and the law will follow. So that's an aside about the abolitionists. Yeah?
Talking about that, we live in a retributive justice system, which is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There's new movements about restorative justice that doesn't follow that. That our justice system is actually an injustice system. If you make a judgment on someone, we will always have the race problem is being made more complicated. Because in retributive justice, white will always be right, and black will always be bad. And so that's an added psychological incentive that most people don't realize in the retributive system, which is really an injustice system. So you're talking about an injustice system that we need to change at the same time if we want to get a just government.
Right. Thank you for that. And I would put that in the realm, of the culture shifting. And that's why our methods matter. And that's why you're not going to find that Move to Amend is kind of the group that's like, let's go straight to our Congress people, write them letters and make this happen, because the problem, the way we've gotten into this situation is that we have given away way too much of our power. And so we're not going to get out of it by expecting those people who are now holding it to kind of make right and do the right thing. We need to change the way that we exercise our power, the way that we think of ourselves. You know, we do not act like we have sovereignty as citizens in this country on the whole, you know. Maybe we boycott, maybe we vote, but those are just kind of the bare minimum of ways that we could be exercising our power. And we need to figure that out. So thank you for adding that to the discussion. So in response to the fact that this new group of people make their way into the Constitution, and also, you know, women are right there, right? So the Supreme Court slaps them down, but that doesn't mean they're going to give up. And the abolitionist movement and the women's equal rights movement were actually the same thing. It was abolition was, you know, chosen as the first thing to go after. So this hold of the 5%, I should keep referring to it because normally I write it, 5% of the folks is shaky, right? The other thing that happened at the same time, and you can look at the history of the Civil War through this lens too, and I think both are right at the same time, is that the Industrial Revolution comes to the United States, right? And so the way of organizing capital around human beings and slavery is actually not so viable anymore either, right? And factories and industrialism, and actually not having to feed and clothe people, but being able to say, you're here at work and you're working, and then you go home and you can do whatever you want, like starve, and that's not my problem. I don't need to pay for it. That's the kind of cynical perspective as well of what happens at the same time. So after the Civil War comes a tremendous amount of corruption and graft and collusion of the government with private interests. They make a lot of money on the Civil War. Of course, the rich people don't fight in it like usual, and so they come out looking great. And so remember, corporations are over here, and defining human beings as not having legal personhood is starting to look shaky. So corporate lawyers concoct this idea that corporations should be people. And they make the case to the Supreme Court repeatedly in the late 1800s. And initially the court says, nope, not for women, not for you either. But in 1886, we have this case where the Supreme Court, and folks may know, thanks to Tom Hartman getting it out there, the kind of backstory, which is that it may not have ever even actually happened this way. The court reporter might have just put it in the headnotes. It's unclear whether this was actually said, but what goes in the history books is that the court says, we do not wish to hear the argument about whether a corporation is a person. We already believe that the 14th Amendment applies to corporations, and the case is decided on other grounds. But that's kind of the first toehold that corporations are able to get. And then there's another case subsequently, shortly after that, where they actually officially rule. And so after that, you have this march of cases. And because we've kind of talked about some other things here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a couple examples. Corporations get the Fifth Amendment right the right not to have their property taken in a case in Pennsylvania where they argue because they're people, when Pennsylvania passes a law to say that when you're digging coal as a company, you cannot make people's houses collapse, because you can have mineral rights and property rights, and they're not the same. So someone's house or land can be there, but then somebody else could have rights to the minerals on it, right? And so coal companies had this, and they had this thing that was happening where people's houses were collapsing, and so Pennsylvania tried to regulate that and say, okay, well you can't do that. And the coal industry sued Pennsylvania, got that law overturned, because what they said is, you are violating our Fifth Amendment right to property. The property that you took is our right to future profits. And so your law is either unconstitutional or you need to pay us. And so Pennsylvania was not in a position to pay, so they took it back. I think that's really relevant to the question of fracking, right? of what's going on right now. And also the idea of right to future profits is something that's now written into NAFTA, the FTAA, the World Trade Organization. This is their whole kind of philosophy about how law works. And that started right here with our Supreme Court, well, in Pennsylvania. So corporations get the right to the Fourth Amendment, protection against search and seizure. It used to be that corporate books were open to the public as part of this public institution that they kind of were. But then they make the case that they're private, and so that's why if a worker complains about a safety violation, corporations would actually, and the regulatory agency goes in to try and look into it, they actually can be denied access unless they have a warrant. And that's, of course, then advance notice, right? So there's some other ones that I could go into. There's this timeline that there's not really anywhere to put up here, but if you want to find it online, there's a timeline of all these cases. But in the 70s, corporations really start to look at the First Amendment and say, how do we get that? And it's partly in response to the movements of the 60s and 70s. We have a huge amount of push for regulation that is actually starting to maybe do something around the environment in the 70s. And so corporations say, we got to get more direct access to the government here. So the First Amendment is how we're going to do that. So in 1976, the Supreme Court rules that money equals speech. And with that comes the kind of initial premise that Citizens United is actually based on, that government doesn't have the authority to regulate spending in elections or by candidates in their campaigns. And then there's a case the next year, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti in 1977, where they overturn a law that Massachusetts had barring corporations from contributing to ballot initiatives. And so that is why it's been the case for the last 40-something years almost, that, 30-something years, that corporations cannot be restricted from contributing to ballot initiatives, and no individual can either. Then, though, they also start to work against labeling laws. So Vermont in the 1990s passes a law labeling bovine growth hormone, and in California they pass a law against PG&E, which is this equivalent of P&M here, saying that you have to, that PG&E had to put tips on how to save energy on their envelopes that they sent out to folks. And in both cases, the industry or the companies argue that violates our First Amendment right not to speak. That milk carton, that envelope, that's our private property. And you can't make us put something on it and we don't want to. And those two laws are overturned. But it's interesting because folks probably have bought organic milk, right? Milk that doesn't have bovine growth hormone in it. When you see the label that says this milk does not contain bovine growth hormone, what's underneath that? Yeah.
It's like there's like the asterisk that says no significant difference has been shown.
Right. Yeah, basically it doesn't have bovine growth hormone, but that doesn't mean anything. Right? So why would the farmers who are choosing not to use the hormone put that on there? They don't. The FDA forced them to. But why does their right not to speak not matter as much as the dairy industry's right in Vermont?
Because
right?
they can't
or with the houses.
Big lawyers.
Right, exactly, right. Or with the houses, why are the property rights of those individuals who have the houses not as important as the property rights of the coal industry? Because they don't have the money to back it up. So that's also why corporate personhood really doesn't help. There's some seats over on this side.
Thank you.
Small business, because they're not in a position to exercise these rights. They can't sue the federal government and get laws overturned. They don't have the money to do that. So it's really only the mega corporations that actually have the ability to make sure their rights are enforced. So when corporations move over on this side of the line, the cases that I'm giving you every single time, that's a law that's actually passed by local government, state government. In the case of Citizens United, it's actually the federal government that passed the law in the interest of protecting the public, and corporations sue and overturn it. So what it means is this whole system is completely perverted. And despite the fact that women and in some states, felons and different folks have been able, 18-year-olds have been able to drive ourselves into this document. Corporations have basically become like these uber people that if they want to, and if they have the money, they can just wield it against us and kind of slap it down in the face of our city councils or what have you and say, nope, you can't regulate me that way. And so it doesn't mean we don't have any regulation, but it does mean that any regulation that we might try to enact is potentially vulnerable to being overturned through not just the Roberts Court sympathizing with corporations, but 128 years of legal precedent that is now basically the way that, that is the law. That is, you don't even need to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. We passed a law in Humboldt County that banned non-local corporations from contributing money to local elections in 2006. And they didn't even need to take it up to the Supreme Court because the California District Court overturned it and said you're violating the First Amendment rights of corporations, the 14th Amendment rights of corporations, and the Commerce Clause. And we knew we were doing that. We were trying to kind of provoke this crisis of jurisdiction that I described earlier. But if enough places aren't doing that, then, any Humboldt County or Santa Fe standing up or Mora standing up potentially stands to just be knocked right down by the legal system. And that doesn't mean that can't be a powerful way to open people's eyes up to what's going on. But if we don't actually deal with the foundation, then all these little sparks of sovereignty that folks are exercising stand to be snuffed out by the legal system.